Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good afternoon. My name is Diane Abbott. I'm the Member of Parliament for Hackney, North and Stoke Newington, and also Shadow Minister of Public Health. And this year I celebrate my 25th year as a British Member of Parliament. My lecture is about British higher education and black and minority ethnic students, and it's a lecture to mark Black History Month. But I want to take the system as a whole, put it in some sort of historical context, and see maybe where progress could be made. Well, I hope it'll mark Black History Month. I think Black History Month is very important to remind us that we live in a diverse society and that we should honour it. And I hope it'll make people think a little bit. It's a huge pleasure to be here in Liverpool. And I am here in Liverpool a few days after we had a very important debate in Parliament about the Hillsborough tragedy. Now, I don't need to tell anyone in this hall about Hillsborough, how 96 people died in a totally avoidable piece of official mismanagement, and how the authorities lied and dissembled and covered up for so many long years, until this year the truth has become to light. But I think Hillsborough speaks to many things about Liverpool. It speaks to the fact that Liverpool has seen many dramas of power and class, and in many ways what happened in Hillsborough and the cover-up, as my friend and colleague Andy Burnham says, is as much about class and attitudes to people in Liverpool by the authorities as anything else. Hillsborough speaks to the fact that Liverpool has often been an epicentre of cruelty and unfairness. But above all, Hillsborough speaks to the enormous communal loyalty, the huge qualities of endurance and tenacity, and the capacity of ordinary people in Liverpool, whatever their colour, to just keep on, keeping on. Because there is no doubt, whatever the politicians are saying now, that without ordinary people in Liverpool who persisted over 20-odd years fighting for the truth would not have been revealed. And I've been asked to speak today about the university system and black and minority ethnic students. And the point I will be making today is that we are not looking to see how universities can be nice to black and minority ethnic students, how universities can do them a favour, how universities can show them charity. We are talking about Britain's university system drawing on all the reservoirs of courage and tenacity and ability, all the potential that the people of Liverpool have shown in this one incident in its past. It's not about the university system doing something for black, minority, ethnic, working class students. It's what black, minority, ethnic and working class students can do for Britain's universities. So it's a pleasure to be in Liverpool, a great Victorian city, which has been wonderfully regenerated with finance from, dare I say it, the European Union and a Labour government. But, but a great Victorian city, a hub of empire, but also a city with a dark history of involvement in the slave trade, and great business, and great political dynasties and fortunes built on the blood and bodies of slaves. And it's a city as well where black seamen, the black seamen of Liverpool 8, formed one of Britain's most distinctive and oldest black communities. So there can be no more appropriate city to be here to celebrate Black History Month. So I've been asked to speak about universities and black students, and I think to give my remarks some context, we have to pause and consider what universities are for. Now, I'm going to say something quite old-fashioned about what universities are for, something you will not hear from politicians nowadays, because the narrative nowadays is a very utilitarian model. You go to university to get qualifications, to get a good job, and make some money, which is all fair enough. My son is at university. I hope he will get qualifications, get a good job, and make some money. But you know, university, when we stand back and look at it as a society, is about so much more than getting and spending. University is about so much more than any individual's material aims. Let me quote from Cardinal Newman, a great 19th century Catholic cardinal, appropriate in a city with a powerful Roman Catholic heritage. And he's one of the great Victorian educationalists. And he said about university, bear with me, because it's a slightly long quotation, a university training is the great ordinary means to a great but ordinary end. It aims at raising the intellectual tone of society. It is the education which gives a man a clear, conscious view of his own opinions and judgments, a truth in developing them, an eloquence in expressing them, and a force in urging them. And let me quote as well from a great 20th century world leader, Nelson Mandela, who said the same thing a little more simply. Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. So when you step back and reflect on the uses and purposes of a university system, I believe, and I say it's old-fashioned, it's not what politicians in any party say nowadays, but I believe university is first and foremost to raise the intellectual standards, the learning, the thinking of an entire society. Education is also about enabling every single individual, whatever their economic standing or class or colour, every single individual to realise their potential academically, and of course, in the process of raising the intellectual stock of society, in the process of enabling every individual to realise their academic and intellectual potential, you will have a better society, you will have an intellectually and, yes, a materially richer society. But unless you can stand back and look at what the role of universities in society should be, and understand what role they should play, you cannot fit the situation of working class and black and minority students, I believe, properly into the picture, because it is not about what the system can do for them, it is about what they can do for the system in raising the intellectual tone and raising the intellectual stock and making this a better and both philosophically and materially richer society. But before I go on to talk a little bit more on the theme of my talk, let me tell you a little bit about myself. As you know, I'm a Member of Parliament, and my family are from Jamaica. They're from a little parish in the centre of Jamaica called Clarendon. It's a little parish in the centre, and it's a hilly parish. And they come from a very small village called Smithville. Smithville doesn't really cover the footprint of this university. If you drive through it fast, you've missed it. So they came, both my parents, from this small, dusty village in the 1950s. And they had both left school at 14 because, actually, that was routine for black men and women in the Caribbean before independence, before the Second World War, and in the 50s and 60s. They didn't stay on at school, largely, until past the age of 14. So they left school at 14, they came in the 1950s. My mother was a nurse, my father was a factory worker. But my father was a very intrepid man, and he did a remarkable thing for the era. This was the 50s. He moved from what was the close-knit West Indian community in West London, North Paddington, Notting Hill, Willesden, Hars, and he moved from there and he moved out to suburban Harrow, which his friends thought was really quite shocking and very brave of him. And so my brother and I went to grammar schools in Harrow, which at that time had no other black people there. If I saw a black person on the street on my way to and from school, I would run home and tell my mother. It was such an event. So yeah, we were in Harrow, and he was the only black boy and I was the only black girl in my grammar school. His grammar school was also the grammar school attended by someone I was to get to know a little bit better in later life, Michael Portillo, but I'll return to that. So I remember getting a little bit anecdotal to give you an idea of the context in which I see educational issues. But I remember in my primary school, I was, and I say this with all modesty, brilliant at writing essays. My essays were always pinned on the wall, you know, in front of the whole school, and I was known to be a little star girl when it came to writing essays. Then I went up to grammar school. And it was incredibly exciting going to grammar school. I had this extraordinary uniform, an extraordinarily ugly uniform, if the truth be known. But at the time, I was very proud of it, right from my felt hat to my lace-up shoes. So anyway, so I started grammar school. And I had my very first English lesson. I've never forgotten the name of the teacher, Miss Peck. Remember, this is a girl who's known to be a star at writing essays. So I had my very first English lesson, and we had an essay assignment. Then I had my second English lesson, and she started the lesson by reading out the grades from the essays we had submitted the week before. And she started at the top, A+. And here I'm in grammar school. So she went to A, she went to A-, she went to B+, she went to B, she went to B-, she went to C+, she went to C, and then she stopped. So I put up my hand rather tentatively, because although I was the young Diane Abbott, I was in my first few weeks and first term at big school. I put up my hand tentatively and said, "You've not read out my name." And she said, "I'll speak to you afterwards." So at the end of the lesson, I went up to her, and she was standing in those days in grammar schools anyway. The teacher stood on a little platform. So I went up to her, standing on a little platform, and she looked down at me. And she didn't just look down at me physically, she looked down at me metaphorically also. And she picked up my essay like this. And she looked at me, and I was this little chubby girl with these plaits and these pebble lenses. She looked down at me, And she said, without drawing breath, she said, where did you copy this essay? Because she couldn't see the 11-year-old Diane Abbott and believe that she could use words and write an essay like that. Now, I was mortified. Nothing about my primary school career had prepared me for this. And you see, what happened for the remainder of that year, having been humiliated like that once, I consciously, just that tiny bit, underperformed at English. I didn't use some of the words I knew. I didn't use some of the ideas I had because I wasn't going to be humiliated like that again. And the point is this: people underestimate the extent to which the way the education system regards them shapes the way that many of our black children perform. And because I've been there, because I've helped mothers and mentored children that have been there, I think it's always important to stress that children will respond to your expectations and how they regard you. It happened to me. Unfortunately, in my second year, I had a wonderful English teacher, a wonderful English teacher, Miss Landry. She was tiny and Welsh, and she really believed in me, and I went forward from there. But then the next seminal moment in my education was in the lower sixth. It was a grammar school, there was a sixth form. And the boys' grammar school routinely sent maybe half a dozen, maybe more boys to Oxford and Cambridge. The current ambassador to Washington, Sir Nigel Shinewold, Michael Portillo, Clive Anderson, the television presenter, a whole lot of them. But the girls' school, as was the way in that era, didn't routinely send girls to Oxford or Cambridge. In fact, it was considered a big deal if you went to teacher training college. So, but what they had done for us that year in the lower six was they had taken us on a coach trip to Cambridge. Well, I was just blown away. I saw those young people striding around, to my mind, full of effortless confidence in their striped scarves under the dreaming spires of King's College and the King's College parade. I saw those young people striding around, and to me, I thought they looked like gods and goddesses. And somehow, the child of a mother and father who had both left school at 14, who had no relatives that she had met at that point, who had ever stayed on in further education, let alone go to Oxford or Cambridge, decided that was what I was going to do. So in the lower six, I remember going up to my history teacher, because there was a discussion, because the point was, we're going back now over 30 years, and in order to do Oxford and Cambridge entrance over 30 years ago, if you were a state school child, you had to take a Latin exam. You didn't have to take a Latin exam to study Latin. You had to take a Latin exam to do any subject which wasn't a science subject. If you wanted to do English, if you wanted to do history, if you wanted to do philosophy, if you wanted to do politics, you had to take a Latin exam, which is one of the not so subtle ways they kept working class children out of Oxford and Cambridge back in the day. So basically, if you were a state school child to go up to do Oxford and Cambridge, you had to really do an extra term, because you really couldn't do it within the confines of the ordinary curricula. So I went up to my history teacher, and obviously the school would have had to facilitate that. And they'd already picked out one girl, Penny, who was going to do the extra term and do the Oxford and Cambridge entrance. And I bustled up to my history teacher and said that I thought about it, and I wanted to do the Oxford and Cambridge entrance, a special exam. You see, you do a Latin exam and you do a special entrance exam. Not like now when you can do it on the basis of your A-levels. So I went up to her and I said, I wanted to do the Oxford and Cambridge entrance. And she looked at me, a piercing look, and she said, yes, but, she said, I don't think you're up to it. And something, I don't know what it was, It may have been the ghosts of my Jamaican peasant ancestors. I don't know what it was, but something made me say, quick as a beat, but I do think I'm up to it, and that's what matters, isn't it? And that was how, rather against her will, I got to stay on at school that extra term, do the Oxford and Cambridge entrance, and in fact get into Newnham College, Cambridge, over 30 years ago. But the point I'm making is that just because people aren't running around in white hoods burning fiery crosses, even if people might imagine they're very fair and they're very liberal, the truth is, it was true when I was a child, and I believe it remains true today, that one of the challenges that black young people face, both at school and at universities, is a set of unspoken assumptions which simply do not work for them. And one of my passions then, ever since I left university, has been education. Because as I say, I am the child of the generation of West Indians that came in the 50s and 60s. Very often, they had to do jobs which were jobs they were actually overqualified for. Literally, in the 50s and 60s, you could employ a black man and a white man on the same factory line and pay a black man less just because he was black. The law allowed that. They came here, they did jobs, they didn't get the promotion they might have had, they had to struggle to have their qualifications accepted. They had a much harder time than any of us have now as people of colour in the society. But you know, they believed that for their children it would be better. And they believed the way it would be better would be through education. And I believe that the way the education has failed, the way the education system has failed black children, both at the school level and following on from that, the university level, is, I think, perhaps more than the relationship with the police, more than relationship with the states, more than anything else. It is the failure of the education system to allow so many black children to realise our potential, which is the greatest betrayal of all. But when we come to look at black and minority ethnic young people in our university system, as I say, we have to stand back and say, what is the university system for? We also have to understand the history of the British university system. Sometimes people talk about the British university system as if it was set up to meet the aspirations of the mass of ordinary young people. Well, that is not to understand the history of the British education system going back to the 19th century. The British education system, if you go all the way back to the 19th century and the Victorians, was a system set up to provide a particular type of education for the elite, the people that were going to run and administer empire. And this was largely deemed suitable. The suitable thing was deemed to be a kind of classical education. But it was meant to provide a suitable education for an elite, but it was almost built into the system that the mass of children that pass through the system, if they pass through the system, were actually being fitted for their role in society. And that was certainly the case up until 1945 in a Labour government, which introduced, for the first time actually, universal, free, secondary education. It's because people don't remember the origins of education in the Victorian era that they sometimes appear so surprised that there is still a class bias in terms of who the education system really works for. But the other thing to remember about education, and this goes back to the Victorians too, and it's almost in conflict to the first thing I said, the Victorians believed in the transforming power of education. Albeit for the lower and middle classes, they wanted an education that would fit them for their role in society. But they did believe that education could transform them. And that's quite different from some educationalists nowadays who say, well, what do you expect? They live in a certain sort of part of Liverpool. What do you expect? They live in Brixton. What do you expect? They live in Hackney. What do you expect? They're black. What do you expect? There's almost like a type of educationalist who is willing to concede that where society places you is kind of more or less where you should stay. And what we have is the class nature of Victorian education, with the notion that you're supposed to be ultimately electing a lead, but without the Victorian belief that education could transform your reality. Education could make you a different person, albeit maybe not a different person to be a colonial governor, but certainly a different person to be a skilled craftsman or a teacher. And the history of a university like John Moores, going all the way back to the Liverpool Mechanics Institute, is a history of the notion that education had the power to look at people where they were, very, very ordinary people where they were, and shape for them a different reality. There's a number of things institutions can do. First of all, they need to make sure that at every level in the institution, it reflects the diversity of their student population. It's unlikely that an institution which is completely dominated by people from one ethnic group or class will be able to be sensitive or culturally literate about a diverse student body. It also, in a pastoral sense, needs to make sure that the institution is available and engaging with all students, including black students. And it's not just a question of rocking up when the children in the sixth form are saying, have you thought of applying to Oxford? It's about engaging with the children much early on, even when they're taking their A-level choices. There are still able children who would benefit from a Russell Group University, but don't have the confidence, don't think it's for people like them, don't think it's diverse enough. And the onus is actually on the Russell Group Universities to break all that down and make sure that they're getting the full range of talent in their university, not just people from a particular class background. Just as the British university system has not been able to escape the ramifications of what was ultimately a system designed for an elite, it's not been able to overcome some of the racial disadvantages built into our society. You know, I can remember being at Cambridge in the early 1980s and there being a handful of black undergraduates. All these years later, my son is there, and actually, there's not much more than a handful of black undergraduates. But I don't argue that Russell Group universities are the end-all and be-all. But nonetheless, the lack of representation of BMA students across the piece in higher education, I believe, is problematic. But first of all, we have to remember that Britain's black and minority ethnic population actually cares very much about education. Some educationalists tend to get into a narrative which says that if black and minority children are failing at school, failing at university, maybe it's because their societies, their communities don't care. But that's not true. Immigrants always care about education because education is going to be the ladder for their children and grandchildren. But the fact is that as we speak, black students face any number of challenges. They face the challenges that all working class children face at this time, the constraints on universities, the amount of debt students are now expected to pile up. And let me say this, I am, as you've heard, a front bench spokesperson for the Labour Party. But I believe that the last Labour government, although it did a lot of wonderful things, such as making billions available to regenerate Liverpool, also did some things that were wrong. I think the Iraq War was wrong. I think ID cards were wrong. And my view, and it's a minority view, my view was that we were wrong to introduce tuition fees in the first place. And I voted against. I voted against tuition fees under a Labour government, and I do not resile from that. Because even though the tuition fees initially were relatively modest, the truth is that I come from a position, I said it right at the beginning, when universities are for the good of the whole society, therefore the whole society should pay through taxation, in my view, which is the fairest means of raising money for a social good. No one expects that if we're at war, suddenly individuals put in their pocket, and if they don't put it in their pocket, soldiers aren't going to fight for them. Because having an army, these used to be things which were widely acknowledged, even in my party, but not anymore. Having an army is recognised to be a universal good, so we all pay out for it out of taxation, so it's there when we need it. And I happen to think education is the same. So no, I think tuition fees were wrong in principle, and it was quite predictable what would happen. We would set them up in a fairly modest way with all sorts of help and exceptions. Then you get a Tory government, because you always get a Tory government. You know, politics is a pendulum thing, and they've ramped them up in a way which I think is going to cause chaos and confusion in the sector for years to come. So, and what I'm seeing in my part of London, the East End, is families where an older child may have gone to university. They're the first in their family to go to university. They may have racked up debt of 40, 50,000, and they still can't get a job. So what are their younger siblings to think? You know, what do they think about whether it's worthwhile to go to uni as well? So this is a big challenge for working class students and particularly for black students. But black students also have specific challenges. Some of you will have read the NUS Race for Equality report, which showed that 1 in 6 black students experienced racism in their place of study. 1 in 3 didn't trust the institution to handle the complaints properly. 1 in 3 felt their educational environment made them unable to bring their perspective as black students to lectures and tutorial meetings. And every university in the sector has its merits, but it's striking to me that black students are disproportionately represented in the universities towards the bottom of the league table, and very, very scarce in Russell Group universities, even when the universities are quite... I mean, London has the full spectrum of Russell Group and everything else. And, you know, you can get one university a bus ride away from another university. One is 3/4 BME. The other, the BME students, are almost solely foreign students paying top money. And in Oxford and Cambridge, as I indicated earlier, there have been years when not a single college, when some colleges didn't admit a single black student. But the problems in higher education are only the beginning for our black students. There's all sorts of evidence that when they leave university, it's harder for them to obtain employment. There's been research that says that job applicants with foreign-sounding names are 25% likely to get an interview than those with British-sounding names. And there's been, although universities pay lip service to diversity, there's been a reluctance to look at the institutional failings behind their institutional underperformance in relation to diversity, both as a sector and in relation to individual universities. And a few years ago, I worked with the NUS Black Students Campaign, Doreen Lawrence, and the heads of all the major teacher unions to ask that the then Equality and Human Rights Commission, which I have a luminary of sitting in front of me, issue compliance notice to all FE colleges. Unfortunately, they didn't do that. And so some of the institutional problems remain. But we know what some of the fixes are for some of the challenges which black students continue to face. One interesting thing is anonymous marking. I don't know if you have anonymous marking here at this university, but what they found was that where a university implements anonymous marking, not just for exams, and for coursework, the results of students with typically African and Asian names go up. Because what they had found was when there wasn't anonymous marking, students with typically African and Asian names, got 12% lower marks. Now, those of you that are tutors and students say, no, surely not. But that's what you find if you actually mark everything anonymously. This is all about, you know, the teacher that said I had copied my essay, the teacher who said I wasn't good enough to go to Cambridge. They would have said that they were being objective, they were being fair, but actually they were prisoners of a whole set of subjective assessments and assumptions. And I think some of that still lingers in our education system today. Some universities have won the campaign for anonymous marking, both in exams and coursework, but the campaign goes on. Well, I think universities need, particularly universities outside of our big cities, need to make it clear that racism will not be tolerated. I mean, you know, in London, certainly in the big London universities, which are very international anyway, there's maybe a degree of tolerance, but you can go outside of London to universities in places where they don't see black people normally, and all sorts of unpleasant things can happen, and universities need to make it explicit from the first day of the first Freshers' Week, this behaviour will not be tolerated. Don't say it's a joke, you can get sent down. And once people understand that those racist, quote-unquote, jokes can get you sent down, I think that will help them to modify their behaviour. Well, you can't say that you've got a master's degree and you experience crippling institutionalised racism, but I would say that at every stage in my academic career, there was a kind of default amongst tutors and teachers that, you know, that could this black girl really do it? We also have the background to underachievement is some of the racist incidents you hear about on campus. At Oxford, you had blacking up parties and parties bring a fit Jew to dinner parties. You have university lecturers publishing papers on the mental inferiority of Africans. This was in Leeds. Racist graffiti on student unions buildings in Staffordshire and other places. Debates on justifications for Islamophobia in Sheffield and other universities. Signs saying, bring back slavery. And now you have the tremendous pressure being brought on international students, the majority of whom are from Africa and Asia, in relation to immigration issues. And the cap on immigration will only lead to further targeting of students from non-European Union countries. So there's a challenge, both in some of the subjective and unexamined assumptions of teachers and lecturers, and there is a challenge in relation to a background of low-level racism in some of our towns and some of our communities. So what is the answer? Well, I think that the problem certainly doesn't lie in universities alone. In order for black and minority ethnic students to be able to achieve their potential at universities, you have to fix the schools. More has to be done in schools. All the evidence is that where children are emerging from school with the grades and with a willingness to apply, they stand a reasonable chance of getting into a Russell Boot University. The problem is that some of these children are failing in school. The stats are very clear when it comes to BME children. When black children enter the school system at age 5, they're doing as well as white and Asian children. By the age of 11, they're starting to drop off, particularly black boys. By the age of 16, the gap between black boys and the rest is huge. And so, you know, a lot of BMA children simply are not in a position by sixth form to offer the grades or have the aspirations to enter university. We have to do more in the schools. We have to do more to make schools not take for granted the differences in achievement by race, but to seek to ever narrow that gap. We have to do more to make sure that students are studying the right subjects, not just subjects that their teachers think it'll be easy for them to get good grades in. And we have to make sure that BME students have the confidence to apply to university at all, but also to apply to whatever university they want, including Russell Group universities. But at university, what can be done? Universities have to have closer links with schools. It's not enough just to rock up in the sixth form and say, have you thought of applying to John Moores or have you thought of applying to the LSE? They have to be linking with schools at the point where children are deciding on their A-level subjects. Universities also have to look at themselves. One of the findings of the NUS survey was that students didn't have confidence in institutions to deal with their problems or even to treat them fairly. And you see, the truth is that many universities, even quite ethnically diverse universities, when you look at the lecturers, the teachers, the heads of department, the management, you see very little ethnic diversity at all. And it seems to me, if universities are serious about diversity, they have to have diversity amongst their own lecture workforce and amongst their own management. Not because only black people or Chinese people or Indian people can teach other black, Chinese or Indian people, but because in a 21st century university system, you need teachers and lecturers and management and senior people in that university system who are culturally literate, and you only have that cultural literacy if that workforce of teachers and lecturers and management actually reflect the diversity of the population. I think Black History Month plays a really important role, not just for black students or black people, but for the entire community to be reminded. In a society which can sometimes denigrate black people or say, oh, black people are just sportsmen and singers, what Black History reminds us of is the contribution that black people have made to society in a whole range of different areas. So it is a good thing that they're having this event. And of course, Liverpool has, in what was Liverpool 8, one of the oldest black communities in Britain, made up of black seamen. So Liverpool has a particularly iconic status in the history of race in this country, so it's particularly appropriate that this uni is marking Black History Month. Universities also need to signal that there is zero tolerance of racism, and I do mean zero tolerance. You wouldn't get some of the disgusting things you hear about, some of the harassment, actually some of the sexism that you're hearing about in Freshers Week and so on. You wouldn't have it if universities signalled there is zero tolerance, and you can get sent down for some of these incidents of racism. It's not a joke. It's not youthful high spirits. Some of the racist actions and slogans and activities help to create a climate where even those BME students who get through don't have the confidence they should have in their organisation, in their institution, feel, in a sense, their expectations for themselves shaped by the expectations of the institution, and it's an institution which doesn't look like them. So let me try and bring my remarks to a close. I believe education isn't a utilitarian thing. You do it to get qualifications, to make money and move on. That is part of what happens, but ultimately, university education as a whole and university education is a benefit for the society as a whole. Therefore, society as a whole has to have access to it. I believe that although we've made progress on these issues of diversity, we need, one at the same time, to leave behind the Victorian notion of an education system which is really ultimately about educating an elite, but to rediscover the Victorian notion that education could be transforming and can run counter to what is happening in communities and societies amongst what can run counter and actually elevate people. We need to understand that not just having lectures like this, which is great, not just paying lip service to diversity, which is great, but actually in a range of practical things, including in their own hiring practices, universities can do more about diversity. And we need to understand, above all, that a British university system in the 21st century, which was working hard to engage with and to empower and to allow to achieve their potential, the full range of British society, black or white, whatever race, whatever ethnicity, a British university system which was reaching beyond the traditional classes that have always gone to university and allowed the full range of persons to achieve their potential, would be an education system which didn't just fulfill the hopes and dreams of Victorian educationalists, didn't just fulfill the hopes and dreams of a Nelson Mandela. It would be a British education system which would keep Britain moving on the road of a world-beating society and economy. Diversity isn't a frill. Diversity isn't an optional extra. Racial fairness isn't something you can do or not choose to do. Racial fairness, equality, and justice is at the heart of the future for this country. Thank you very much.